All right, this is obviously based on the presentation I gave this morning, which means we've already answered a couple of the prompt's questions. What is this project trying to accomplish? Make whiskey in space. That's pretty much there on the title. Why hasn't it been done yet? I also discussed that, right? It's impractical right now, the costs, the technology required, as well as the fact that the experiments so far have not figured out how to make space whiskey taste good. And ideally, that's what we want. We want it to actually taste good. But this prompt asks us, from the year 2035, when we look back, what would we have started in 2024 to make this a reality? And Tiffany asked a really great question in our group discussion. Well, what's the value proposition? And we came up with these value propositions that in 2024 would incentivize us to start thinking about how in the future we could end up making whiskey in space.
It's 5 o'clock, friends. How many of you could use a drink? Have you really thought, though, about how that drink gets to your lips? So we think the answer for that in space in particular is no. And so our first deliverable that we look at is a white paper to map out the various problem spaces, which I prefer to think of as opportunity spaces. So there's scientific and technical issues, right? How do you make sure the ethanol doesn't blow up in space? How do you genetically engineer the yeast to make these things? That's just a drop in the bucket. We expect to flesh out a lot more of those. What's the economic model for this? What are the environmental concerns that we have? Politically speaking, what's the licensing for this kind of thing? And socially, what do we really value about whiskey in particular? Now, our friend Nathan is only one man. So our idea would be that by breaking this complex issue down into jobs to be done, we could bring it as a curriculum to a place like either the International Space University or Explore Mars to get innovators excited and taking on one of these pieces of the jobs to be done, and then skating to the 2035 puck to bring it together in the end for whiskey in space. He's got one.
I think one of the other things that came out of the discussion was that, one, everyone understands what whiskey is. Everyone understands what bourbon is. And people who are into these things also understand the distillation process. But the distillation process is one part of the issue. The other is all the externalities that come with the operations itself. So in terms of looking at all the different component parts, as she pointed out, it's what actually will fit into life on a planetary body or in space with this type of technology. So on one hand, what's interesting is the fact that it plugs into any sort of ISRU closed loop life support system, and even provides a variety of different test beds that you would need anyway to feel confident that you can actually settle that place or build upon what you've built for your settlement. So for example, as part of the process, you need the yeast. Well, yeast can be used in a variety of different other food sources. So you can start baking bread in space. You can have your pizza in space along with your bourbon, for example. But the process of dealing with the off-gassing and temperature controls, and as well as just the way that it would churn through the corn and whatever other wheat, barley, whatever else goes in there, gives us a sense of how fluids move. And then you have the issue of, okay, at the end process, you have vapor, you have all these other things. These are things we have to naturally deal with. So if we can model this in an analog situation, you can get a lot of failure really quick to get a system that can work and be put into operation as quickly as possible. Because everyone in that closed habitat simulation, if it is off-gassing, is going to get drunk real quick, and we're going to have a real good idea about what could possibly happen, which in and of itself is a problem because that goes back to team performance. You don't want a bunch of drunk astronauts. So how do you, lastly, deal with the ethical considerations of having alcohol in orbit, right? So on one hand, it's a comfort, gives you a sense of being back home. When you're very far away, you can't go back. But there's going to have to probably be some set of operational rules to limit consumption. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of extra problems on your hand.
So what have we done in the past 10 years since Nathan Johnson presented this at 2024? We've done a lot of thinking and distributing and sharing the goals and the processes with other people who will help us put together the technology, who will help us set the precedents, who will help us talk to the labeling agencies and the government to talk about what laws might need to be changed to make this inclusive. And in 2035, as Tiffany said, we've been able to put all of those answers together so that we can start making whiskey in space.
And we could do it for under $1 billion. Woo!